Welcome to History 112, Lecture 16, World War I and Domestic Policy. The immediate impact of American entry to World War I really happens at sea, where American destroyers are going to assist Britain in dealing with the U-boats. Now, U.S. warships are going to start escorting merchants all the way across the Atlantic, and Allied shipping losses fall, and very quickly, Germany's attempt to cause economic pressure on Britain using submarines really starts to collapse. It's soon clear that given the massive losses suffered by Britain and France and Russia's withdrawal, American ground troops are going to be needed to ultimately win the war. So, right when we show up, it's very much felt at sea, and there's a realization that we need to start sending troops over to Europe in order to make sure this war goes the way we want it to now that we're in on it. In order to accomplish that, Wilson realized he needs quite a large army. So he asked Congress for the Selective Service Act in May of 1917, and he uses that to draft almost 3 million men into the armed service, and about 2 million more volunteered. Out of that was formed the American Expeditionary Force. It's going to go to Europe, and it's going to represent the largest and most sustained military effort outside the nation's borders until World War II. So this is something on a scale of which the United States had never previously engaged, and it's going to be very well organized under the command of General Pershing. Now, American forces were only involved in direct combat for a short period of time, spring through fall of 1918. But American forces are going to help the British break the stalemate of trench warfare, because what's going to happen is the United States is going to send a huge number of additional troops. Now, they're fresh and not combat hardened, but they can take over a lot of defensive positions and free up a lot of French and British forces to go on the offensive. Now, the United States can participate in some key battles and also take place in some of that fighting, but the pure number of Americans just pushes the tide of World War I very much against Germany, and by November of 1918, they're asking for an armistice, and the war ends for all intents and purposes on November 11th, 1918. During that short period of time, the United States loses about 112,000 men, although half of that's from influenza because of the 1918 pandemic. Now, France, Britain, Germany, Russia, Austria, they're all suffering casualties in the millions. The American casualty rates were high in relation to other American wars, but they're very low compared to our European allies. And a lot of that has to do with new technologies, including tanks, chemical weapons, and so on. Now, the cost of this war for the United States dwarfs spending on all other wars. $32 billion is what we spent, and about 2/3 of that was raised through Liberty bonds and 1/3 through new taxation, and a lot of it has to do with corporate taxes and the graduate income tax as well as inheritance taxes. The U.S. is going to face significant challenge when it comes to mobilizing the economy and putting on a war footing. And remember, the United States is in the war only really for the very end, so we very quickly have to move from peacetime to wartime and flood Europe with all the men and supplies that are needed to win the war. So Wilson, to do this, is going to settle upon what are called war boards that are going to oversee key areas of the economy, and they're going to ultimately be coordinated through the War Industries Board. And this is going to really be a retreat from the antitrust agenda. And what he's going to do is he's going to put the control of the economy under a Wall Street financier, and what they're going to do is they're going to combine all these companies back into effectively trusts being run in the interest of the war effort. Now, what's going to happen is Bernard Brock, the man who's in charge of this, is going to provide the illusion of order and efficiency. And he's going to provide this image of these highly efficient super trusts being combined by the government to really keep prices low and production efficient, but that's not really what's happening. It's really just a matter of smoke and mirrors, because it's the resource and productive capacity of the United States being just so massive at this point that fuels the war effort. But the results look good, so Wall Street and these people who had been very pro-trust are going to receive all of the credit. Now, there is this thought from progressives that the War Industries Board, as effectively a super trust, would create a model for strong government regulation, because you have the cooperation of business and government being run in the national interests. And there was this natural tendency towards consolidation, with big businesses being successful, buying small failing ones, or at least that's how they saw it, that this seemed like the best of both worlds. And it's going to be business leaders who are ultimately going to step in and really lead this new war effort, and a lot of them become known as dollar-a-year men, because they left their old corporate jobs and work for a token salary, sometimes literally $1 a year. And they are going to come together because they know how to run these businesses, supposedly, at least that's the theory at the time, and run the War Industries Board and all these industries in the national interest. What it really does allows these corporate executives to get around all of the antitrust laws and allows these companies to reap massive profits. So it looks very good on the surface and it looks like high cooperation, but behind it all, really the government is turning a blind eye to the sort of old business tactics that had existed and that it worked so hard to get rid of through antitrust laws because we're at war. So the idea of what we need for the war sets aside a lot of the old reform agenda that had been in place before World War I. In addition to the National War Industries Board, there's also going to be a National War Labor Board because organized labor is being affected by the growing leap between public and private sectors. And the National War Labor Board is going to use some of that government power and the government leeway during this period of close cooperation to help workers gain a number of concessions from industry leaders, including the 8-hour workday and the rights of unions to organize and collectively bargain. However, workers in various sectors are going to continue to fight for greater rights and clash with business because while the government is using its power to give many important concessions, there's still quite a bit to be done from a labor point of view, and sometimes this can result in very bloody clashes, Ludlow, Colorado being a really good example to know. And throughout this time period, we have to understand what progressives are really doing is they're trying to put the idea of the war and national unity ahead of various things that in and of themselves might deserve attention. They just don't feel they're the highest priority. Now, progressives really thought the war would promote national unity because the nation was very divided when we first went into it, and a variety of people are going to continue to support the peace movement because of ethnic ties, religious principles, or beliefs. And the most sustained support for peace and the biggest pushback against the war effort came from the women's movement. The National American Woman Suffrage Association is going to throw its support behind the war effort, but a lot of other feminists are not, and a lot of them are going to claim that their status as wives and mothers gives them an obligation to oppose the war. They argue that because American society only allows them to be a wife and a mother, they're not a voter, they can't participate in public life, any of that, that they therefore have a duty to do only what is within that role. And the role of a wife and a mother is to desire to protect those people. Therefore, they argue that they have a moral obligation to oppose the war because America will not let them play any other role within society. So in other words, they come out and say, no vote, no support. While the women's movement did not universally support the war, women do serve in the military for the first time, although they are barred from combat, and that's a ban that continues until fairly recently. There's also about 400,000 African Americans serving in mostly segregated non-combat roles. Now, some people who had fought in those units were fighting because they thought that this would somehow help address racism at home. In other words, they believed that if they went out and proved their commitment to the American cause, that this would translate into things getting better back within the country. But what you have to understand is racism is not just endemic in American society, it's endemic within the military as well. So these ideas about trying to use military service to prove how American they are and how willing and eager they are to stand up and how therefore they deserve to be treated the same, these efforts, while they come from a good place, are ultimately going to fail. What is far and away going to have a greater effect on the African American community is the Great Migration, because the war is creating economic growth within the U.S. as far back as 1914, and that's going to help minority groups and women gain access to new opportunities, because once the war is ramping up, and especially once 5 million men go into the army, there's an actual labor shortage, so there's lots of new economic opportunity. So hundreds of thousands of African Americans are going to move from the rural South to northern industrial cities. That is going to lead to tensions with older African American communities, and you are going to see race violence from 1917 and 1919 happening as a result of this. But what's going to be a lasting impact is a lot of these people are going to move to the north and have a whole set of new opportunities and new challenges, and that's going to help start remaking America in a number of ways. While the government and progressives really hope that the war would bring national unity, that's not necessarily going to be the case. They recognize that early on, so they create the Committee on Public Information, and they're the government agency that is responsible for selling the war, so to speak. And they're going to disseminate more than 75 million pieces of pro-war literature and send around thousands of 4-minute men who were going to go around the country and deliver short speeches, all designed to help sell the war to people and get people to really believe and back it. And as the war progresses, the CPI's propaganda is going to become far darker in terms of its portrayal of Germans, and they're going to start to increasingly demonize that population, and so it's going to have some negative consequences as well. In addition to simply as trying to sell the war through speeches and pieces of propaganda literature, the CPI is also going to get legislation passed that's going to curb dissent. The Espionage Act of 1917, for example, is going to allow the government to ban seditious materials from the mail and establish harsh punishments for spying, sabotage, or in any way obstructing the war effort. The Sabotage and Sedition Act of 1918 is also going to make it a crime to criticize the president or the government, and the government's efforts really are going to be targeted at the IWW, that's the Wobblies, or the industrial workers of the world. We're talking about socialist leaders here, and Eugene Debs, for example, is going to be sentenced to 10 years prison, although he's going to be pardoned in 1921. And it's all going to be based on this idea of sedition and criticizing the government becoming illegal for the term of the war, and that's a major step back from the ideas of free speech that kind of are enshrined in the Constitution. But that's not the only time we're going to see this. War has a way of dialing back rights, and this is a very good example of that. Now, the idea of suppressing dissent is not going to be limited to the government. There's also going to be a 100% Americanism movement, and private groups like the American Protective League are going to target immigrant groups under this banner because they say everything should be 100% American, and they're going to target Germans in particular, and they're going to try to root out what they see as German influence on American culture, and they try to get people to rename sauerkraut Liberty Cabbage and hamburgers Liberty Sausages, for example. They want to get rid of anything German sounding and rid the country of all German influence. Now, that's not a movement that's very successful, but we do have to understand that during the time of this war, the country is not divided, and this disunity means that people are going to target groups who have a legitimate right to do what they're doing, but during the course of the war, a lot of rights are going to fall by the wayside, and it's going to become socially acceptable to target groups, for example, for being too German. So what's the big idea here? Well, first of all, World War I brings about a very close link with corporate America. Although there are some improvements for labor, really corporate America is who's going to benefit. Now, there are worker shortages because of the 5 million men entering the army and so on, and that's going to lead to new opportunities for women and minorities. We should also understand the country is far from unified. There's a backlash during this time period against socialists and immigrants, and Germans are going to get the worst of it by a long shot. See you in the next lecture.